So now, 10 minutes in, we got to get into some content. Opening content, there's a lot to cover, and we're going to try to merge skill sets with it as we go along. Opening topics. What are we looking at here? Oops, wrong way, my apologies. Cold War and the Red Scare. Your first of your topics here, and the opening topics of period 8 are thematic. It's a widespread 45 to 80, so it's really on that connectivity in many ways. The origins and motivations of the Cold War. If I were going to sum this up in a non-fact heavy, content heavy, delivering you a lecture for 3.5 hours way, I would begin by stressing that the origins of the Cold War tensions are born out of the contrasting experiences and the differing aims of the West and the East. The United States is the only great power that comes out of the Second World War more prosperous than it entered it. Even our allies, the French suffered 4 years of German occupation. The British were bombed in the Blitz for 5 years. And as for the Japanese and Germans and Italians, they were ground into powder by the violent conflict itself. Their entire infrastructure is destroyed. The Soviet Union exits the war as a victor, having lost 20 million people, civilians and soldiers, and massive economic destruction within their country. They won the same way you win a marathon. They won by finishing, not by being, strong and healthy and hardy and hale at the end. So this informs both sides' perspectives. The United States is interested in creating perhaps the American century, a world of free trade, global agreements, a world of enterprise and commerce and nations collaborating, working together towards a better non-global war future, whereas the Russians have faced 3 great invasions from the West in 150 years. Napoleon in 1812, Kaiser Wilhelm in 1914, and then Adolf Hitler in 1941. Their main point of view and perception is we just need to be ready for the next thing that comes. And it's a zero-sum game. We have to gain. Our gain means that the West must lose and vice versa. There were goals of a worldwide expansion of communism, but there was no set timetable for that. So over the course of the first 3 to 4 years, from about 1945 through 1947, American foreign policy establishment has to come to the conclusion that our idea of the way things ought to be is foundationally different than the Soviet Union's ideas and desires for what they want. And so this leads to the Truman Doctrine and policies of containment as the Russians began to erect an iron curtain, carving off the Eastern Europe as sort of a sphere of influence of itself for the Soviet bloc. So Americans then come to the conclusion that maybe staying out of foreign affairs, as Dr. Webb talked about yesterday, might not be the answer to a safe and stable world. The dead hand of George Washington's farewell address is actually finally taken off of American foreign policy. And the country you know today, with a global sort of reach and footprint that can reach out and touch someone militarily or economically, and has these vested global interests, that sort of national foreign policy structure and apparatus is created in the aftermath of World War II as a desire not to have a World War III against a Soviet aggressor nation that is seen by the United States as being actively interested in undoing our way of life. The Berlin airlift, of course, the Soviets is an example of a way to wage the Cold War. The Cold War being this fight where you don't want to give in to the Russians and appease. Remember, Berlin was in the Russian sector of Germany, and they cut off the landlines and the land supply lines, hoping the Allies would just give up and walk away. Instead, the Allies flew supplies into Berlin for over 1.5 years through authorized corridors. That then puts the ball in the Russians' court. Do you want to shoot down jets or shoot down planes and provoke an act of war, or do you not? This is Cold War thinking. You don't want to give in, but you also don't want to engage in a hot war either. So you try to find creative solutions. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and those that asked, abbreviations like this are perfectly allowed. Just explain them first. And the Marshall Plan, unlike after World War I with reparations that we wanted all the money back, the U.S. actively, with the European Recovery Program, engages in trying to rebuild the European economies, thinking that conditions of communism thrived in damaged economies. And so we even give money to our former enemies, the Germans and later on the Japanese, to sort of rebuild their economies on the notion that stable economies will produce free societies and vibrant societies. As for the Korean War, it's a new concept. It's a war between the great powers by proxy, which is a very common thing in the Cold War that stays a limited war. Truman is advised by Douglas MacArthur, his commander in the Far East, to prepare to use nuclear weapons to stop the Chinese. MacArthur claiming there's no substitute for victory. Truman does not want to engage World War III in that model with this kind of aggression, and instead tries to fight a war essentially to preserve the status quo. MacArthur, believing this to be the wrong course of action, goes public with his concerns, and this actually brings to the fore a vital part of American constitutional law, which is the generals in the military, they don't create policy, they follow it. Truman fires MacArthur for this. In so doing, MacArthur becomes a martyr and a hero to the anti-communist right, but it does reaffirm the idea of civilian control of the military. The Eisenhower administration evolves away, not wanting to fight limited wars, into a policy of brinkmanship and massive retaliation, building up a nuclear stockpile to try to inform the Russians with our big stick that if they do something we don't like, they need to be prepared for nuclear war. This is good, except the hard thing about playing a game of chicken is knowing when to flinch. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, 2 clicks down the page, is an instance where brinkmanship almost really did lead to that close to global thermonuclear war, at which point both sides sort of discover, to their surprise, that maybe being right at the brink of instant annihilation is not the best plan. As for American domestic policy, the similarities of McCarthyism to the first Red Scare, this Red Scare is sort of foreign policy driven, where the first Red Scare of the 20s was more economically and internally driven with fears of changing the American economy in many ways. This one has a foreign policy angle, as McCarthy uses his power as a senator from Wisconsin to go after Americans for their political beliefs and try to destroy their reputations and destroy their chances to work in the country as retribution for their being communists. Eventually, he exceeds his mandate, goes after the army, and goes after government at a time when the Republicans control government, so he's no longer of use to his party. He's ultimately censured for his actions. By the 1970s, as I said, this is a big, long theme, you have the Nixon administration recognizing communist China as a way to play a game of triangular diplomacy, to sort of play the Chinese and Russians off against each other to create gains for the Americans. This leads to what is known as détente, or a thawing of the Cold War, and the signing by the Richard Nixon administration of some of the first strategic arms control disarmament treaties on nuclear weapons, the SALT Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I and SALT II in the 1970s, come out of this process of sort of thawing the Cold War. As for post-war America, there's lots of economic prosperity in the United States that we see after the post-war. You have 15 years of an artificial suppression of birth rates and marriage rates due to 10 years of depression and 5 years of war that is now a lot of people buying back those lost opportunities in the baby boom, and the war put money in their pockets. Remember, World War II, economic production for the war, successfully redistributed American income, which the New Deal did not do. The New Deal does not cure the Great Depression. World War II does. It's the ultimate jobs program. And so people had that money and they had the opportunity and began making up for lost time in families and careers and workplace and homeowning growth and all that. Suburban growth comes out of this entire process and brings with it, among other things, the process of redlining, through which there was preferential lending and discriminatory lending for neighborhoods for persons of color or lower, less affluent neighborhoods, which allowed the white middle class in many ways to advance and preserve their wealth in the form of real estate in a way that was sort of denied to lower income or persons of color Americans in that process. The National Highway Defense Act also makes the suburbs possible. By building the interstate highway system, it hollows out America's urban cores as suburbs become places for residents, the so-called bedroom community, and cities become places for work. And this is going to engender white flight, as we'll see a bit later on. The GI Bill, which of course provides for Americans, servicemen and women, to have low interest loans for housing or college education or starting businesses after World War II, becomes a real adventure in prosperity for the American public and allows them to engage and further advance their middle-class American dreams. Consumerism in the mass media, very much like the 1920s. We see, if in the 1920s, radio and the motion picture were the driving elements, in the 1950s, it will be the television, which sort of brings people together, and of course, rock and roll music and pop culture with that. You do see this trend of movement towards the Sun Belt, the Southwest in particular, but the American South in general, as our populations move away from the Great Lakes Industrial Basin and New England, the factory workshops areas of there. And like the 1920s with the Lost Generation and the Harlem Renaissance, you have pushback by cultural and literary critics that argue that America is this sort of conforming society that in many ways is too sort of stifling in that conforming. And the Beat Generation in many ways will give birth later on to the hippie movement and the counterculture that we'll see at the 1960s. As for the civil rights movement, also thematic, and it's a big theme. Our origins here for this second phase of civil rights, as opposed to struggles of the post-Reconstruction era or the progressive era, has its origins in the Second World War, the so-called Double V campaign of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, fighting against totalitarianism, in many ways exposed the hypocrisies of the Jim Crow American system as well. And there are some victories that began deleveraging this sort of apartheid color line system that the United States had lived under since the end of Reconstruction. Truman desegregates the armed forces in 48. The Brown v. Board decision undoes the Plessy decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which had said that separate but equal was allowable. This is undone. And of course, you get pushback in the South. So you should remember some of these things with Governor Orwell Faubus refusing to carry out this mandate, which leads President Dwight Eisenhower to send federal troops into the South to integrate Little Rock Central High School, federal troops being in the South for the first time since Reconstruction. The Jim Crow system, exemplified in the murder of Emmett Till for speaking to a white woman without her consent or approval or that of her husband, really exposes the brutality, the bloodiness, and vindictive violence of this system, and changes people's minds, particularly in the African American community, to activate against this. The Montgomery bus boycott, which from Rosa Parks fame, in which you see nonviolent economic protests being established as part of the civil rights toolkit to engage in change on public transportation, public transit, to also abolish the color line. Also morphing then into sit-ins and lunch counters for service, desegregated service in North Carolina and beyond. So to continue this movement, that's a huge amount to put on one slide. I get that. And that movement continues on the second slide as we touch these major themes here. The early movement culminates in the March on Washington in 1963, which was actually a march against poverty, which Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech, a dream that's still being sought, and then voter registration, the Freedom Summer, as college students converge on the American South to register African Americans to vote in situations and systems in which they'd historically been denied that opportunity, which incurs pushback and violence from the white South. The twin pillars of success of this first phase of the civil rights movement are the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which outlaws discrimination and segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of '65, which outlaws poll tax, grandfather tax, and discrimination in voting patterns. It is at this point that the civil rights movement itself, the realization of these two big goals, it begins to divide into one camp being the Martin Luther King, a camp that followed King's teachings, let's put it that way. The camp that espoused nonviolence and a continued incrementalist approach to change, and then a separate wing, generally a younger wing, a less college-educated wing, that was more impatient with incremental change and wanted more immediate delivery of natural rights now, as opposed to waiting for white society's schedule to deliver those rights. That would be the movement of Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, etc. In many of these communities in the late 60s, you had this impatience exploding into violence in urban areas, such as Newark and Detroit and Watts and Los Angeles, generally over policies of containment and suppression, acrimonious relationship with law enforcement, or frustrations with a class and race system, which was limiting the potential for persons of color and minorities to rise and have their share of the American dream. This is not like certain disorders you can see for causation and linkage within your own time. Through places such as Minneapolis or Ferguson, Missouri, or even Charlottesville, Virginia. School desegregation promotes the response of white flight to the suburbs, as we talked about, where many of these white communities are recreated outside of these suburban rings or urban rings. These movements for civil rights expand beyond merely just African Americans. And it's clear that the patterns, the toolkits, the strategies used by the American Indian movement, the Brown Berets of the Latino Chicano movement, Asian Americans, the women's movement, the National Organization of Women, and gays and lesbians, particularly after the Stonewall riot, they are all adopters of the civil rights activism toolkit pioneered by the African American groups. And you can trace that thread on a line in many ways. So let's look at an example in real application for multiple choice here if we could. Stimulus, a quick crash course review. It's 40% of the test, so it's worth you understanding how it operates. The curriculum framework, as we discussed, this is what is tested. So it's not content. As much as you want content, what is being tested are concepts and topics. Content can be used as evidence as you understand those concepts and topics, but it's your understanding of the concepts and topics the questions will test. The link down here gives you the framework, the language in which the multiple choice questions are written. Items are set-based, 2 to 5 items are on the same stimulus. They can be secondary sources, maps, pictures, cartoons, graphs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but some of you might not be, so I wanted to show that to you. All items, your multiple questions per stimulus, they will all function independently. No item is going to help you answer another one. And no item is going to give you 3 comparison questions and 3 contextualization questions. We will test different skills for each item of every question you receive for a stimulus. So let's read this piece here. Short answer prompt for skill and content, since we're talking civil rights. Current sit-ins and other demonstrations are concerned with something much bigger than a hamburger. Whatever may be the difference in their approach to their goal, students, North and South, are seeking to rid America of the scourge of discrimination, not only at lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. So what's our question here? First of all, it's a context question. The tactics you're talking about here best represent which. So it's sort of a backgroundy thing. How do we get here? What's going on here that's driving this prompt? Is it about nonviolence, filing legal challenges, self-defense, petition to government? Well, sit-ins, more than anything else, they weren't really about filing legal challenges. That was something we'd seen in other movements. It's nonviolence, nonviolent nonconformity to the laws of the land, which were seen as immoral laws. Way back thinking, sort of a transcendentalist theme there. Second question, which you will discover, is a causation question. The events described contributed most directly. So sit-ins led most to what? Desegregation in armed forces? Well, this is why I say pay attention to your source codes. If you remember that Truman desegregated the military in 48, well, it can't be 1960. Ratification of the 15th Amendment, whoa, now you are way back in period 5. That happens when the Civil War amendments, if you know your chronology. That's why 4x4 and chronology are so important. Supreme Court decision on Brown, that's 1954, and it's on education in particular. It's not really on this, which leads you to the non-discrimination passage, Civil Rights Act of 64. So you can pick them off sometimes if you know the things that are being discussed in there. Now, your proper nouns here, 15th Amendment and Brown v. Board, they are actually named in the curriculum framework document itself. So as I said, any proper noun you do see, they are fair game to be tested. Why did I show you those 2 questions? Because those 2 types, what led to this and where did this come from? These are the most frequently tested skills in multiple choice. Well over half the questions that you get, no matter what the stimulus is going to be this kind of topic. And I can't stress the importance of being prepared to see a question about why did this happen and what's the backstory to this stimulus we're talking about. That's what you're going to get. Let's get ourselves back to that period 8 content for a little bit then, shall we? Moving on to the 60s, even though it is part of the Cold War politics, the Vietnam War has its own separate topic within the framework. It does have ties to those earlier foreign policy goals of containing communism, or even the domino theory, that if one country goes communist, it'll knock down the other countries around it and they will all ultimately be communist. And the idea was, that the logic was you had to fight the communists in Southeast Asia, or tomorrow you're going to be fighting them in Kansas City. It was that whole kind of like appeasement thing. We can't give away anything on Czechoslovakia or he'll take the whole thing that Dr. Webb was talking about so astutely yesterday. The challenges the Americans found were the same challenges that you have had a front row seat to on the evening news in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the exact same challenge the British faced as the Redcoats during the American Revolution. If the Revolutionary War was England's Vietnam, then the Vietnam War is America's American Revolution, with the United States playing the role of the British Redcoats. We are fighting big and heavy. We've got a military that's built to fight the Nazis in 1944. We send this military to fight the Nazis in 1944 into the rice paddies of Southeast Asia in 1965 to fight an unconventional war against an irregular force with the same inevitable results the British had. It's very difficult to fight asymmetrical counterinsurgency warfare with a military designed to, beat large nation states. The Tet Offensive, a surprise attack in 1968 in which every major American military base is hit all at the same time, leads Americans to lose belief that the war is ultimately winnable. And this becomes known as the so-called credibility gap. The Johnson administration kept saying, victory is right around the corner, right around the corner, right around the corner. And increasingly, no one bought that and did not believe what the government was saying. This engenders a protest movement where SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and a host of other youth-driven organizations that also don't want to be drafted, as well as believing the war to be wrong, protest against the war on a large scale. And by the late 60s, dissatisfaction with the war and the administration are so large that it almost no longer needs organization. Movements and marches could spontaneously generate traction on their own. The counterculture emerging out of the Beat movement, this so-called hippie movement, actually wants to reject American society and say that the American society is a lost cause. We need to actually form our own sort of culture against this and kind of drop out of the American model. You do also see this outpouring of both the counterculture and the youth movement, environmental activism. 1970 is the first Earth Day. The Nixon administration is going to establish the Environmental Protection Agency as a cabinet-level agency. And Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is a book talking about the ravages of a potential ecological time bomb going off where we destroy our own planet environmentally. Changes a lot of minds. To back up for a moment to what those minds had to be changed from, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as president, wanted to out-New Deal the New Deal. And so the big government liberal state policies that he implements after his landslide election in 1964 are really driven by this model of attempting to fight a war on poverty, Medicare and Medicaid, which are medical programs for the poor and for the elderly, Job Corps for job training and job placement for young people and poor people across the country, the aiding of impoverished regions of the country like the urban city and rural Appalachia and Indian reservations as well, and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, enfranchising people who historically have been marginalized. This over time will generate conservative pushback because it costs money and it results in high taxes in many ways. And you see the pushback of a conservative Christian evangelical America against both big government and a nation at protest at war with itself internally that they think is just going through a nervous breakdown. And so you see tax revolts as Americans of that white middle class begin rejecting the idea that government can solve these problems or should solve them and come up against what they see as the limits of the welfare state. You also have these culture wars, this generation gap from the 60s leading to culture wars over issues such as race, diversity, inclusion, ethnicity, religion, abortion, music, literature, and culture. That all comes out in this sort of back and forth, us and them attitude. So back to our content. And why was that question important? Why was the previous content important about Americans' views on the Great Society? Well, because of the Reagan era as a consequential presidency. Reagan is mentioned by name in the framework. He's extremely testable because his philosophy is going to set the parameters and drive the discussion in American political thinking on the role of government. Remember Dr. Webb was showing you the triangle of classical and modern liberalism? This is going to drive that conversation from the Republican point of view, from Reagan's point of view, for the next 40 years, up into almost into your lifetime. It's a rejection of both the Great Society and New Deal approaches to governance. And you have these shifting views of the welfare state. In the 30s, when the New Deal was primarily a program that aided white middle-class Americans, the New Deal was largely seen in the political narrative as being this positive good, helping people that were down on the luck and not their fault. By the 60s, as these social programs have a real thrust and emphasis on poor Americans in general, of all races, all colors, all creeds, you begin to see a shift within the white middle class of Americans that maybe these programs are not such a good thing because of the beneficiaries and the directions it's going. This goes along simultaneously with a switch in party allegiance as white Southerners who had never voted for the Republican Party, being the party of Lincoln, the party of the Civil War, the March to the Sea, all those things, they flipped their political alliances. And today, the modern party alignments you see with the Republicans, the South being not largely, but a heavily represented Republican voting area, and northern and more diverse populations voting a bit more Democratic, that's where that inverts itself. And many reasons for it involve this quote from Reagan, one of his most famous quotations, that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. And the entire philosophy of Reaganomics, of the conservative right, which is still in many ways Republican Party orthodoxy today, is cutting taxes, supply side or trickle down economics, cutting taxes on the wealthiest of Americans, and presuming those benefits will trickle down to everyone else. Very sympathetic to a conservative Christian evangelicalism and a strong military. Conservative on social issues of abortion, gender, same-sex marriage, sexuality, gender roles, post-Reagan. Ending of the Cold War and economic change. The intensification of confrontation with the Soviet Union, part of the Reagan-era military buildup, it generated an economic race more than an arms race that the Soviet economy was not built to sustain. And the Gorbachev administration, his leadership, they ultimately realized the Soviets couldn't win in this race, and trying to actually keep up with the West in terms of the arms race spent the Soviet Union into economic oblivion, from which ultimately led to their collapse in 1989 and 1990. And that's the result of a lot of long-term policies on the Cold War, going all the way back to Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. But it culminates itself in these policies with their collapse. You've got a brief period of unipolar rule where there's one superpower being the United States in this global world, but Nature abhors a vacuum, and we're not going to stay in that position, and we're going to shift to a unipolar or multipolar geopolitics as you see the rise of the Pacific Rim, the rise of China in many ways, and shifting priority of policies to the Middle East and to activities you see in subcontinental Asia in terms of India, Pakistan, and China as well. Technological revolutions, you've lived this life. You are all babies of the internet, right? The interweb. And so the economy creates new winners and losers as you have outsourcing of jobs, globalization, workforce obsolescence with technology and robotics. You walk into a grocery store or a department store or home improvement store today, often you're going to check yourself out. There's no cashier anymore. Well, where'd that cashier go? Self-driving automobiles and trucks are just around the corner. Wages have remained stagnant for the middle class for about 40 or 50 years, even though the rich have gotten richer and great affluence has been created for the elite technological class and those who can possess information and know what to do with it. The shrinking middle class, for their part, struggles to keep and make ends meet as college education seems more and more difficult to reach every year. We are in the middle in this time of a third great wave of immigration. New arrivals from new locations, South and Latin America, Asia and India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the requisite similar pushback that we've seen in other eras leads to forces against multiculturalism, forces advocating for immigration restriction. And more, you see the same arguments play out with different groups. The arguments against the Irish in the 1840s, against the Italians and the Jews and the Slavs of the 1900s are the same arguments employed against the migration waves today. Different people refuse to assimilate. They'll take our jobs. They'll work for cheap. They won't be part of our culture. These same parallels exist and drive all nativist thinking in all eras. The 9/11 terror attacks lead to the Bush doctrine of preemption, which is strike others before they strike you first to prevent wars, which after 20 long years, this very year it appears, we will withdraw from Afghanistan, a war that's gone on longer than you've been alive, seeing the limits of some of these open-ended conflicts and the limits of a national security state, which is still in many ways unfolding for us today. Lastly, the environmental challenges of your own time with climate change, global warming, and energy and resource consumption as we try to adequately provide the greatest good for the greatest number and live a life of comfort and establishment for all people, along with social and economic and political